The night Plácido Domingo said pop singers couldn't do what opera singers do, he had no idea that a woman in a borrowed dressing room 3 floors above him was about to make every word of that sentence disappear. He said it confidently, the way only a man who has spent 50 years being undeniably right about nearly everything can. He said it to a room full of journalists, music directors, and admirers who all nodded, because that was what you did when Plácido Domingo spoke about the human voice. And then Whitney Houston walked onto a stage and turned his certainty into the most expensive silence of his career. If this story moves you the way it moves everyone who hears it for the first time, subscribe and hit the bell. Because we tell the stories music history forgot to finish. It was the fall of 1994, and the world was still trying to process what Whitney Houston had done to a Dolly Parton song. I Will Always Love You had already become the best-selling physical single in history. It had already made Kevin Costner cry on camera. It had already been played in every dentist's office, every elevator, every wedding reception from Newark to Naples. And somehow, impossibly, people were still not done talking about that note. That sustained, volcanic, roof-lifting note at the end. The one that didn't sound like singing so much as it sounded like a building deciding to take flight. But here is what the glossy magazine covers and the Grammy podium speeches left out. Here is what the standing ovations and the platinum plaques didn't say out loud. Whitney Houston, in the fall of 1994, was quietly terrified. Not of the crowds, not of the cameras. She had grown up with those. What terrified her was something smaller and somehow louder than any of it. It was the question she couldn't stop hearing in the back of her mind, whispered in the voices of people who loved her and people who didn't. Is this the peak? Is this as far as you go? Because the music industry in 1994 had a particular cruelty reserved for women who reached the summit too fast. You got there, and immediately the conversation shifted from how high you'd climbed to how long before you started sliding back down. Whitney had been told in rooms she was not supposed to know about that her voice was a commercial instrument. Magnificent, yes. Technically impressive, certainly. But built for radio, for movies, for the kind of beauty that needed a hook and a bridge and a producer's careful hand to survive. Not built for the naked stage. Not built, in other words, for what Plácido Domingo did. Domingo had said it at a press conference in Vienna that October, answering a journalist's question about the crossover between popular music and opera. His exact words, translated and reprinted in several American publications, were something to the effect that popular singers, no matter their natural gifts, lacked the disciplined technical foundation to sustain real vocal art. He wasn't naming names. He didn't need to. The journalist had mentioned Whitney Houston in the preceding sentence, and Domingo had not corrected the implication. He simply answered, with the gracious authority of a man who has sung in every major opera house on earth. And the answer landed in the music world like a politely dropped grenade. Whitney read the quote on a Tuesday morning. Her assistant found her sitting with the magazine open on her lap. Not angry, not tearful, just very still in the particular way she got still when something had gotten all the way through. She didn't say much about it that day. She didn't call her publicist. She didn't ask anyone to draft a response. What she did was pick up the phone and call her vocal coach, and what she said was, "I need to work." What happened next is the part the profile pieces always rush through to get to the dramatic moment. But the weeks between that Tuesday morning and the night of the benefit concert deserve their own paragraph. Because Whitney Houston did not simply show up and sing. She worked in a way that people who had been working with her for years said they had never quite seen before. She worked past the point where her voice was tired. She worked through a chest cold that her doctor said should have put her in bed. She worked on breath control exercises closer to what a conservatory student would do than a pop artist. She was not preparing for a concert. She was preparing for something she could not fully name. Something that lived in the part of her that had been listening to those whispered doubts for years and had finally decided to answer them. The benefit concert was held on a Thursday in late November at Carnegie Hall, one of those evenings where the tickets cost more than a used car, and the program is printed on paper that feels milled from the pages of history. The cause was arts education in public schools, which meant the room was full of classically trained musicians, conductors, and music patrons who did not, as a rule, spend much time thinking about pop music as an art form. Plácido Domingo was scheduled to perform in the first half. Whitney Houston was scheduled to close the show. Nobody in that room quite understood what they were watching during Domingo's portion. He was magnificent, the way he always was, with the kind of vocal authority that feels less like performance and more like the weather. When he finished, the audience gave him the standing ovation he had earned 10,000 times over a 5-decade career. He was heading backstage when a mutual acquaintance made the introduction. A brief, polite exchange in a narrow corridor, the kind of encounter that usually means nothing and leaves no mark on either party. But something in Domingo's expression, just for a fraction of a second, held something that was not quite dismissal and was not quite respect. It was the careful courtesy of someone who had already formed an opinion and was being very well-mannered about it. Whitney felt it. She had been feeling versions of that expression her entire career. She turned and walked to her dressing room without a word. She sat alone for 11 minutes before she was called to the stage. People who were with her that night described those 11 minutes differently depending on who you ask. Some say she was praying. Some say she was completely motionless, eyes closed, hands loose in her lap. One person says she was humming something so quietly it was barely audible. Something that sounded like it came from a church in Newark in 1974. Something her mother had sung before Whitney ever knew what a recording studio looked like. Whatever it was, when she stood up and walked toward the stage, the air around her had changed. That is not a metaphor. Multiple people noticed it. The makeup artist, who touched up her lipstick, said she felt it like a change in temperature. The program called for 3 songs. What the program could not have anticipated was what those 3 songs were going to become in the hands of a woman who had spent 11 minutes somewhere beyond the reach of doubt. She opened with "I Have Nothing," and the audience, half of whom had come prepared to be politely appreciative of the pop star closing the show, went absolutely quiet in a way that Carnegie Hall audiences almost never go quiet. Not the respectful, attentive quiet of classical listening. The stunned, disoriented quiet of people who have just been told, without words, that their assumptions about something were wrong. Her voice was filling the hall the way the hall was designed to be filled. Not over it, not around it, but through it, using the acoustics the way a trained concert artist uses acoustics, letting the room work with her instead of fighting it. People in the 4th row would later say they could feel the sound in their sternum. But it was the second song where the evening became something people would carry for the rest of their lives. She chose to sing Ave Maria, not her own arrangement, not a pop interpretation. The full, unaccompanied Schubert setting, performed in a concert hall where Schubert had been the standard for over a century. The pianist began and Whitney closed her eyes, and what came out of her was not a pop singer being brave and slightly out of her depth. What came out was the sound of a woman who had earned, through grief and discipline, and the kind of courage that does not announce itself, the right to stand in that room and sing that song. The sustained passages that classically trained critics had suggested required a kind of technical foundation she did not possess. She moved through them the way water moves through a canyon, with the ease of something that has been finding its path for a very long time. The high phrases that her detractors had categorized as tricks, as commercial effects, as the vocal equivalent of pyrotechnics. They were there, but they were not showing off. They were doing something more important. They were telling the truth. And the truth was that Whitney Houston's voice, at its deepest and most unguarded, was not a pop instrument or a gospel instrument or a classical instrument. It was all of those things simultaneously, and it was also none of them, because it was entirely and only itself, and there is not a category on earth that fits something that singular. Domingo was still in the building. He had planned to leave after the first intermission, the way headliners sometimes do, not from rudeness, but because the evening was long and the car was waiting. He did not leave. He stood in the wing and watched the second song from 30 feet away. When it ended, the Carnegie Hall audience did something audiences there almost never do. The applause started while the final note was still decaying in the air, which is practically unheard of in that room. And it became the kind of sustained, rising response that means everyone in the room simultaneously decided that something had happened and needed to be marked. Domingo did not applaud right away. He stood very still for a moment, his hands at his sides, and the expression on his face was something that people who know him well say they had never seen there before, at least not in response to another performer. It was not the generous, collegial appreciation that performing artists show each other at events like this. It was something older and less manageable than that. It was the expression of a man who has just had a certainty quietly and permanently rearranged. He found her backstage after the third song. The room was full of people saying the things that are always said in those rooms after extraordinary performances. Domingo waited. He was not a man accustomed to waiting, but he waited. When the crowd thinned enough, he took her hand in both of his, and the conversation they had was brief enough that two people standing nearby could only catch fragments. What they heard was Domingo saying something to the effect that he had been wrong, not elaborating, not explaining, not offering the kind of qualified reconsideration that powerful men often substitute for genuine acknowledgement. Just, I was wrong. Whitney, by the account of both people who were nearby, said nothing in response. She looked at him for a moment with the kind of steadiness that comes from having done the one thing you needed to do and finding it was enough. Then she smiled, the real one. Not the magazine cover smile, but the one her mother's church had put into her at age 11, and she turned back to the room. She never gave an interview about that night. She never referenced Domingo's comment publicly, never used it as a talking point, never let the press turn it into a rivalry the way the press very much wanted to. The story exists almost entirely in the accounts of people who were in that building, passed from musician to musician, from music director to vocal coach, in the particular oral tradition of people who understand what it means when a room full of serious listeners loses its composure. It lives not in headlines but in the quiet memory of those who were present for something they knew. Even as it was happening, they would never fully be able to explain. The voice that Plácido Domingo called technically limited had just done something in his presence that required him to walk across a room and say two words he did not often have occasion to say. The voice that the industry had categorized, packaged, and occasionally condescended to as a commercial instrument had just demonstrated, in one of the most demanding acoustic spaces in the world, that it answered to nothing so small as a category. Whitney Houston never needed to say a word about what happened that night. She answered the way she always answered, the only way that ever really counts. She opened her mouth and she sang, "Have you ever felt the crushing weight of everyone's expectations only to silence them with your true gift?" Tell us your story in the comments below.